This is Stanford Engineering's The Future of Everything, and I'm your host, Russ Altman. If you enjoy The Future of Everything, please remember to follow it in whatever app you're listening to right now. That way you'll always be alerted to new episodes, and you'll never miss the future of anything. Today, Nora Freeman Engstrom will tell us that access to lawyers is a key problem throughout the United States, that sometimes 3/4 of cases have only one lawyer in the room and the other party is not represented. It's the future of legal representation. Before we get started, please remember to follow this podcast, The Future of Everything, in whatever app you're listening to. That'll make sure that you're always alerted to new episodes. So when we think about law cases, let's take civil cases, not criminal. In criminal cases, you are guaranteed to have a lawyer. Guess what? In civil cases, you are not. And so when we imagine two lawyers going at it in the law court, that's not always what happens. In fact, in a large fraction of cases, 3/4, in fact, one side doesn't have a lawyer. And guess what? You don't tend to win when you're up against a lawyer and you don't have one. Well, Nora Freeman Engstrom is a professor of law at Stanford University and an expert on legal ethics, legal representation, and ensuring access to justice. She's going to tell us that there's a big problem in representation. It has historical roots. It causes unfair outcomes. Even when people know that the law is on their side, they sometimes, a lot of times, lose. She's going to tell us what is happening to try to address this, and why can't we have the equivalent of nurse practitioners for law? Nora, what led you to focus on legal representation and access to justice as a major portion of your scholarly work?
Long taught ethics at Stanford, and part of ethics is you do think about the fact lawyers are supposed to be, quote, public citizens with a special responsibility for the quality of justice. So that had kind of been in the back of my mind, and I'd written some about how lawyers behave and how they sometimes misbehave. But the real focus on access to justice started about 4 years ago. My mentor and very, very dear friend, Deborah Rohde, who is a giant in the legal world and at Stanford, passed away. And she had run a center on the legal profession at the law school. And I was asked to run that actually along with my husband, who is now the co-director. And so we started running this center on the legal profession, and that caused us to really focus in on how the legal profession is serving and sometimes not serving clients. And then I was just gripped by this sense that there's a real crisis here. And I don't think there had been sufficient attention paid. Now, Deborah had been paying a lot of attention to it. But really thinking this is a crisis, and there are a lot of problems in the world, Russ, and we know that. Yeah. But feeling like, gosh, this is a crisis that my profession made.
So give me the dimensions of this crisis. Like that, this is kind of big news, and I might not have been aware of it. So how do we know? Characterize the crisis for me, if you will.
Yeah, so it is one of these things that is, I think it's a big deal. But it's the big deal that nobody's talking about, right? I mean, and I realize the world is full of urgent issues to think about. But picture a case, right? Picture a courthouse.
Yep.
And what you're probably picturing is two lawyers, and one's sitting at counsel table and one's at a podium, and they're talking to a jury. There's a judge there. This idea that civil cases are places where lawyers square off. And
right.
Frankly, that's what I pictured.
We see this on TV all the time.
Totally. I mean, that's, if you ask anybody to close their eyes and picture a case, whether you're thinking of A Few Good Men, whatever courthouse scene you're picturing, but that's what you're picturing. But that's wrong. That's actually not what cases look like in the United States today. What they look like in the United States today is one side, it's typically the plaintiff, who tends to be a big institutional actor, like a debt collection agency, or a debt collection buyer, I should say, or an institutional landlord, up against an individual. And the individual is very, very, very often unrepresented. So it's one side that is big and powerful and has a lawyer against an individual who is not represented at all.
And just to state the obvious, they should be represented, and they're not doing this willingly as a, like, I'm going to represent myself type situation.
Yeah, I mean, so there are a few things in what you just said that to unpack. One is this should be represented. So you don't have a right to a lawyer in civil cases. So we all think of, there's this case Gideon versus Wainwright that establishes a right to counsel in certain criminal cases. Actually, it's not all criminal cases, which even a lot of law students don't understand. It's only certain big criminal cases and for different parts of the criminal justice process, not the whole thing. But that's the criminal side of the docket. In the civil side of the docket, there is no right to counsel. And so there's not really a
wow.
Yeah, so there's no right to counsel. So and the government or institutional actors can do a lot of things to you, and you don't have a right to a lawyer to help you. So right now, in 3/4 of cases in American courts, at least one side lacks a lawyer. And this is a really big deal. And it is how our courts behave and how our courts are treating regular folks. Right now, what our courts are doing, one judge said to me recently, she said, Nora, what I do is I put on a black robe and I manufacture poverty. That's what I do.
Wow. So I guess we can also assume that the sides that have the lawyer are doing a lot of winning of cases.
They're doing a lot of winning. They're doing very well on the winning front. And what they're doing is they're winning to do things like evict people from apartments, foreclose on homes, or they're bringing debt collection actions to say, hey, you didn't pay us, you're supposed to pay us back. And that leads to garnishment of wages. And what a garnishment of wages is, hey, I'm going to take some of your paycheck every couple weeks or every month, and I'm going to dock it. I'm going to take some out of it.
And that goes directly to poverty, as you just said. That's why the judge said what they said.
Yeah, it goes directly to poverty. And
now, how much freedom do the judges have? Like, if the judge sees what might be a miscarriage of justice, and we haven't even established whether these are miscarriages, but let's say in a case do the judge have any latitude to kind of be some sort of proxy lawyer for the person who doesn't have representation?
It's a great question. So traditionally in the United States, we have what's called an adversarial system of justice. So we've built our court processes to have the clash that the few good men clash, right? Yeah. The judge is supposed to be there, neutral, the referee who is not a player on the field, but is just there to call balls and strikes. And so that's the way judges, it's been kind of driven into judges that's how they're supposed to behave. They're just supposed to be there and to weigh the evidence as presented by the parties. And so recognize that works really well when you have two equally represented sides.
Right.
It's great, right? But when you have one side that's really well represented and one side that isn't represented at all, that model doesn't work very well. So folks call it an institutional mismatch. We have this notion of the judicial role that presupposes a certain thing happening in front of the judge, and yet that thing isn't happening in front of the judge, and yet the judge is still taking this adversarial role. So the judge, some judges are really grappling with what to do because frankly, the judges in this country tend to be incredibly dedicated, thoughtful public servants. And they didn't go into this business. They could surely be making more money doing other things. And they didn't go into, to do what they do with their law degree in order to manufacture poverty. That doesn't feel good.
Okay, so now I'm troubled. We got to the troubled portion of our discussion. Can a motivated, unrepresented individual get help on the internet? Can they do things to prepare to try to put up a defense? Is that just Pollyanna-ish, ridiculous idea from Russ? Where are we? What are the options as you see it?
First is this idea of just, hey, y'all, just figure it out, right? And there's some of that for sure. Although the legal information on the internet isn't particularly good. So the National Center for State Courts recently said self-represented individuals are, quote, drowning in a, quote, sea of junk. And that's because there's some good information out there. It's true. But there's a lot of not so good information out there. And it's really hard to figure out the difference. So that's one problem. Another problem is partly there's this other part of the problem. So what we've been talking about is, folks who are getting hammered by an institutional landlord, right? Or an institutional debt buyer. There's this other side that not everybody is in like a defensive crouch when it comes to law. Some people have rights. They're getting affected in certain ways, and they want to do something to vindicate their right. So picture here a person who is entitled to overtime pay and is working overtime and isn't getting overtime pay, or a person who is getting abused by her spouse or partner and really needs a domestic violence restraining order. Or a person who had insurance and the insurance should cover what just happened, to their home or to their car. And yet the insurance company is jerking them around. And
I just want to say these are important examples because in the case of like debt collection, as long as it's a real debt, then people might not have as much sympathy. And in the case of not paying your rent, but you've just given us 3 scenarios where, the heart is like, okay, this is an injustice.
Yeah, it feels like an injustice, right? And I could go on and on. The person who has the order for spousal support and yet the person isn't, so it's on and on where they actually, law could help, right? And the law on the book says, hey, you're entitled to help here. Like you're entitled to overtime. I'm not talking about somebody who isn't entitled to it. I'm talking about where the entitlement is there. So that's the other side of the access to justice crisis. So I think of it as this 2-layer calamity. So there's the calamity we were just talking about at the beginning, the 75% figure, the folks who were in this kind of defensive posture and getting hammered by law and getting evicted from their apartment or their wages are being garnished.
And are the lawyers just too expensive or not even available?
Yes. Yes, and. So even the DOJ, U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. recently did a study. It's actually hard to figure out like how much do lawyers cost, right? And what they found is a second-year associate costs on the order, and this is a second-year associate, which is to say someone who was in law school 15 months ago, charges upwards of $300 an hour. That's a lot of money, right? You think about all these surveys that say, well, people can't, 57% of Americans can't handle an unexpected $1,000 bill. So lawyers are really, really expensive. There is legal aid out there. So there's this thing called the Legal Services Corporation, and they fund legal aid offices, but they've been sounding the alarm for some time. What they say is, we can only help half the people who come to us and need help and who qualify for help.
Right.
The other half we turn away. And those are folks who are legitimately poor. So the idea is lawyers are really expensive, and our system of legal aid, there are just folks who are so dedicated, who are doing their absolute best and working day and night to try to help folks. But they don't have the capacity they need.
Can non-lawyers help?
Yeah. So that we've just come to a really big issue, which is to say, my son, I'm going to start to say something that's going to sound like it's a completely random aside.
Oh, we love this. We love it. This is the future of everything. Yes. So you can include everything.
All right. So my son was sick the other day. It was over the summer. He got sick. He was at a summer camp and he got sick on a Friday. And he said, well, they told me that, the doctor's office doesn't open until Monday. And I said, well, that's a problem because I thought he had an ear infection. And so I said, well, don't worry. Is there a CVS nearby? And he said, yeah. And I said, okay, we'll take the bus to the CVS and go in, and there's a Minute Clinic there. I, looked, he was in Rhode Island. So looked, and there it is. It's just 2 miles away. And he went to the CVS Minute Clinic, and he got seen by a nurse practitioner. He got his prescription for his ear infection, and it was over in 2 hours. we don't have anything like that in law.
There's no law practitioners.
There's no...
Who are not lawyers.
Exactly. So in medicine, a lot of little things, like my son's ear infection, you don't need a brain surgeon to work on, right? You need someone with specialized training and expertise. You need someone who is available. But you don't need someone who has the full, 4 years of medical school and a 3-year residency, and you've been trained in absolutely everything to splint, a sprained ankle or to look inside a kid's ear.
Yeah.
In fact, in the majority of states, nurse practitioners have full practice authority, which is to say they can diagnose, they can treat, they can prescribe without supervision by a doctor. So that's why this CVS Minute Clinic, it wasn't that this person that my son saw was being overseen by a doctor. No,
Right.
It was just a skilled professional who was practicing within her zone of competence. Law doesn't have anything like that. It is lawyer or bust when it comes to law. You can have a full-on, licensed lawyer who's been through law school and passed the bar and does continuing education, even for very simple things.
So why is that? Why is that? Because, I'm a physician, and I know medicine is highly regulated, and it's usually licensure and stuff is at the state level. And so I'm guessing that CVS thing is a state level decision by Rhode Island to say, we're going to allow nurse practitioners. I'm not sure about that, but could individual states say, wait a minute, we're going to allow non-lawyer legal practitioners do the equivalent of the CVS thing?
Yes, they could. And right now, as we speak, that's a huge fight that's happening. So,
there might be some money involved. Let me guess.
Oh, how did you guess? So right now, it's lawyer or bust. And as we established, lawyers are really unavailable. They're super expensive. And folks, in part because of this shortage, are left to grapple with a system designed by lawyers for lawyers alone. So I call it a two-door problem. In law right now, you can have a full lawyer or you can go on your own.
Wow.
And it's just pick.
Yep.
Pick. There's just two options. In medicine, as we just established, there is this third door. And not all doctors, as you can imagine, were super delighted by the idea of nurse practitioners and physician's assistants and giving them this, very substantial practice authority, but it exists in the majority of states. And the kind of how exactly that happened in medicine is really interesting. I'm co-authoring a book or co-editing an edited volume that will come out really soon. And there's a great chapter in there about how doctors resisted some, and then the resistance was overcome when it comes to medicine. So yes, in law, we could do the same thing. Right now, and I should say this is just an important piece too of, well, why, why don't you just okay, it's not allowed, but surely you can just learn some law and give some advice, right? It is a crime. It is a crime in nearly every state for a non-lawyer to give legal advice without a license. In California, it's a misdemeanor. In some states, it is a felony. And when I say give legal advice, if I were a non-lawyer and I saw my neighbor parked too close to the fire hydrant outside our house, and I went outside and said, hey, just so you know, your car could be ticketed because you're parked too close to the fire hydrant, and it's against the law to do that.
Wow. So that, and you're okay.
We're a non-lawyer.
Wow. So this might be happening all the time. And it's kind of, I guess it's kind of like an incidental use. We can't go after all these people, but if you started to do it, and especially I'm guessing it doesn't matter that you're paid or not. There's no distinction. Even free legal advice.
Free legal advice. And I have to say, this is embarrassing, but I think I was a lawyer and I thought, well, I'd heard of this law called unauthorized practice of law, but I kind of pictured that was if you showed up in court and said, yes, Your Honor, I'm here to represent, and you weren't a lawyer, then that was unauthorized practice of law. But
Right.
no, the state definitions of unauthorized practice of law are capacious. So they really do sweep in the stuff that I just, the fire hydrant example. Now, which is not to say prosecutors are going after this willy-nilly, but it certainly chills anybody's effort to do anything helpful at scale, right?
We're going to come back to this. This is The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman, and we'll have more with Nora Freeman Engstrom next. Welcome back to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman, and I'm speaking with Professor Nora Freeman Engstrom from Stanford University. In the last segment, Nora described for us a surprising situation where so many people, in so many cases, don't have lawyers. In this section, we're going to discuss how some states are starting to address this with experimental programs on non-lawyer representation. She'll tell us about some fascinating history of why this problem has evolved, and she'll end with some hopeful news about how AI, which is not currently useful, may become useful. Nora, you mentioned that some states are changing this idea that you can only have lawyers helping people in these cases. So what's happening in those states?
Yeah, so this is, I said that there's this two-door problem, right? It's a lawyer or you're on your own. A number of states are saying, we should have a third door, right? In medicine, we have nurse practitioners. How about in law, we have something equivalent? So, and this is just, we talked about at the beginning that, I've been thinking about this really carefully for only about 5 years. And it's within 5 years, just coincidentally, that this action has totally taken off. So a number of states, including Alaska, Arizona, Colorado, Hawaii, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Oregon, Utah, and Washington have
there you go.
some way relaxed these unauthorized practice of law rules to let some more folks into the fold.
Well, yeah. What dimensions does that take? Like, how do you make that first step? Is it paralegals? Is it people who are working with lawyerly supervision? Like, what are the models? And I'm guessing they might be very different across the different states.
Yeah, so they're different across different states. So everywhere you can have having a paralegal is not controversial. That's permitted in every state.
Okay.
But they can't practice law. And so they're both restricted in what they can do. And they're also restricted that they have to be under this lawyer supervision. So, again, going back to the CVS Minute Clinic, it wasn't that a nurse practitioner was there looking in my son's ear with a doctor looking over her shoulder. It's the full ability to do this without supervision. And so that's what some states are allowing. And it is a mix of models right now. It is very much a moment of exploration and an experimentation, which is to see what works. There's this idea of community justice workers, which is to say, let's allow our nonprofits, our legal aid organizations to have more non-lawyers helping people without direct supervision, that can be kind of a force multiplier essentially, but they're still being supervised by the nonprofit. And so there's this backstop to ensure quality control. So there's a lot of interesting thought and experimentation going on because everybody recognizes that they want quality to be high, right? You don't want it to be, okay, if you're rich, you get Cadillac counsel.
Right.
And if you're not rich, you get some sort of lawyer light. That we want to ensure that there are high quality, responsible providers. And I think everybody recognizes that just like a nurse practitioner is never going to perform brain surgery, and we would never want that. There are going to be things that you need a real lawyer for, and that these trained, specialized, carefully regulated non-lawyers.
No, it's really interesting because, as I'm part of the training of the nurse practitioners is knowing and recognizing when they're dealing with something that's out of their jurisdiction. So to mix metaphors, and then they can say you need to go to the ER or you need to do whatever. And so there's gonna, obviously, it's just thinking about it. It seems like there's going to be a need for these legal folks, these non-lawyer legal folks to say, I just realized that this case is now out of the domain that I'm kind of credentialed to do. And then the problem is, I'm guessing, that they need to be able to have the emergency room equivalent, and it's not clear if that exists.
Yeah, you're right. That kind of figuring out what kind of that triage model looks like.
Yeah.
And making sure that folks know exactly where the kind of boundaries of their competence lies. So we're in very early days of this. And at the same time, we want folks to be specialized and we want them to be trained, but we can't over-regulate the thing. So Washington State actually did this, kind of tried this a number of years ago with these like licensed legal technicians. And what they did, it was a bit of a cautionary tale in that they regulate, like they made it so hard to become a licensed legal technician that it actually is like, well, if I'm going to work that hard to get that, I might as well
just go to law
school thing, right?
I wanted to ask, has it always been like this? Is this like the last 250 years in the U.S. or did something change, or where did what's the dynamic?
So that was a question that really came to me a couple years ago with like, is this, we just have such a view of when we look at the world to think, well, it's always been this way. There's something, right? There's something baked in about this. And so I started digging into the 1910s and 1920s. And I found something I found was startling, which is in the 1910s and 1920s, they did have a thing where if you weren't a lawyer, you couldn't provide legal advice. But it was different insofar as right now we have this other rule we haven't talked about. We talked about unauthorized practice of law rules. There's this other rule. It's called Model Rule 5.4D, which is really rolls off the tongue. But what that rule says is if you're a lawyer, you have to work for yourself or maybe the government or an organization owned by and funded by lawyers.
Yeah, you made brief reference to this before.
Yeah, so you can't, for example, work at CVS, right? So you can't be, somebody who is a trained professional, but offering legal advice at, for example, CVS. And so I was kind of like, well, that's got to be baked in too, right? That's been part of the legal system since I've...
Yeah, which part of the Constitution outlines that?
Exactly. So in 1910 and 1920, that part of the rule book did not exist. And so you could go into your bank and get a will. There were lawyers in banks writing wills for folks. And there were these things called auto clubs. It was right when the car was developing and the Model T is rolling off assembly lines. There were auto clubs around the country that were thriving. So it was kind of the AAA of yesterday.
Yep.
And the AAA of yesterday, you, with the price of your membership, got a lawyer for all things automobile. For the cost of the membership, you had a lawyer if you hurt somebody in a car, if you were hurt in a car, if you were arrested, they actually would represent you throughout the criminal process. We found cases where they would do habeas petitions. So you, with the price of your membership, got a lawyer for all things legal. And then we found lots of other organizations that were doing similar things. So there were lawyers kind of embedded into life where folks had access to lawyers as part of other things, right? So
what happened?
So the bar, it turns out 1930s were not a time when a lot of money was sloshing around, right? The Great Depression, lawyers were feeling the pinch like everybody else. And they looked around and decided that they did not like the competition, essentially, and they decimated it. So I have a piece that came out this fall with a former student called Auto Clubs and the Lost Origins of the Access to Justice Crisis. And what we trace, and it was a really fun project that my co-author former student James Stone went around the country to archives and auto museums. And
Oh, this is super fun.
Yeah, it was really.
And you can also see why somebody like Henry Ford would have supported this, because he needed to sell cars. And if that was a big concern, if he could allay that fear, he could sell more cars.
Totally. So actually, Auto Club started as this of trying to like encourage people that that automobiles were not just a rich man's toy,
right?
And so, but then once like Americans were like, we are in, we own cars. Car ownership by 1928 was extremely broad in the United States. So there was the sense of like, well, we got to give people confidence that it's going to work. That if they get into trouble with driving, we're gonna have their back. And actually, auto clubs did other things too. They did do the AAA stuff of roadside assistance. They also lobbied for because at the time, I mean, we had roads that were set up for horses, and all of a sudden we needed them to be set up for cars. So we needed all sorts of speed limits and jurisdictional lines and things like that. So auto clubs did all of that too. But what I think is so fascinating is that we can then, if we squint, we can envision this
different world.
Yeah. A past where you could have gone into CVS and gotten not just your ears looked at, but also like,
an oil change.
Yeah, I need to think about, my name change. I need to think about this adoption I'm trying to do.
This is fantastic. And so, and we could go on, but we only have a minute or so left. And I want to ask you about AI, and because you said before that it's a mess, that when people go on the internet, I believe you said sea of junk. And I want to know if AI is included there now, or if that's a ray of hope that it actually might not be so junky. I know that I'm positive, and I'm sure you know this, that people are typing legal questions into ChatGPT. There's no doubt in anybody's mind, because I know that they're doing that for medicine. They're doing that for everything. What's your take on the likelihood that that stuff will be useful and will empower people, perhaps in the context of these other innovations, such as what the states are doing and going back to the AAA days?
I mean, I'm sure other folks know that AI is only as good as the data it's trained on, right? And right now, the data that can be trained on is not very good, and so AI is not very good. But there is a ray of hope here, and that is there is an entity in all this that we haven't talked very much about that it turns out knows law really well, and that entity is courts. And so when I said that courts, nobody likes to put on a black robe and manufacture poverty, they also look around and look at the rather dismal state of affairs, and they're thinking hard about how can we help. And so something else that gives me hope is LA Superior Court. So LA Superior Court, they adjudicate 3 times more cases per year than all federal courts combined. Unbelievable, right? The biggest court system in the world. And they have looked at the situation, and they see that it's a terrible, terrible problem. And they are thinking hard about, we have access to information. Right now, the information that's publicly available is bad, but we could help people.
So they do have information that would be useful.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And they can curate and sift through the bad information and figure out what is good and what is bad. And so we are working with them. We at the Rhodey Center on the legal profession are working with them to try to improve things, including by designing AI tools. So I don't think, the AI kind of,
out of the box.
AI that sifts through what's on the internet is not going to be good anytime soon. But there is this possibility that we, curated information from trusted intermediaries can essentially sift through the sea of junk, and be a life preserver out of it. And so I do think if more courts are like LA, that gives me a lot of reason for optimism.
Well, there you go. There's hope. And thanks to Nora Freeman Engstrom, that was the future of legal representation. Thank you for tuning into this episode. Don't forget, we have more than 250 episodes in our back catalogs. And so you can spend all day listening to me talk to interesting people about their work. If you're enjoying the show, remember to tell your friends, family, colleagues, anyone who you like that this is a good show and that they should subscribe and listen. Personal recommendations are a great way to spread the word about the show and grow our listenership and therefore grow our impact. You can connect with me on many social media platforms, including Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, at RB Altman or at Russ B. Altman. You can follow Stanford Engineering at Stanford School of Engineering or at Stanford ENG.